Rain slicked the docks of Liverpool as the ship groaned against the pier. On board, 40 German women in grey uniforms, faces pale, eyes hollow, hands clutched around Red Cross parcels they didn't understand were a mercy. They expected shouting, humiliation, maybe even revenge. Instead, silence. British officers stood in pressed khaki, eyes unreadable. The air smelled of coal, salt, and something unfamiliar. Mercy. For these women, trained to fear their captors and taught that surrender was worse than death, Britain was supposed to be hell. Instead, it was absurdly civilized. One soldier even saluted them. This is the story of what happens when ideology collapses at the sight of humanity. When the war's victors didn't chain their enemies, but offered them tea. And when a handful of women realized that losing the war didn't mean losing their souls. The morning came wrapped in fog so thick it swallowed sound. The ship that carried them had crossed the channel in near silence, save for the rhythmic thump of engines and the occasional whisper of prayer in German. 40 women stood on deck as the grey outline of Liverpool materialized through the mist like a ghost made solid. They wore the remnants of their uniforms, nurses' whites gone dingy, auxiliaries' greys fraying at the seams. Their faces carried the same exhaustion, the same hollow-eyed wariness of people who'd seen too much and expected worse to come. The gangplank descended with a metallic groan. Below, on the dock, British soldiers waited in formation. Not the vengeful mob the women had imagined during endless nights at sea, but rows of khaki-clad figures standing at attention, their rifles shouldered, their expressions carefully blank. The rain fell steadily, tapping against metal helmets and wooden crates, washing the dock in a sheen that reflected nothing but grey. One of the women, a nurse named Greta, who'd tended to wounded soldiers in Normandy before capture, gripped the railing so hard her knuckles went white. She whispered to the woman beside her, "They'll shave our heads. I heard they do that." Another voice, trembling, "They'll parade us through the streets. Let the civilians throw stones." But when the first woman stepped onto British soil, boots splashing in a puddle that smelled of diesel and sea spray, no one threw anything. A young British corporal, his face pink with cold and perhaps nervousness, gestured toward a waiting truck. His eyes met hers for just a moment, not with hatred, but with something closer to awkward discomfort, the way you might look at an unwanted guest you're obligated to host. An officer barked orders in English they couldn't understand, and the women shuffled forward in a ragged line, clutching their small parcels as if these bundles of donated clothing and soap were anchors to their identities. The dock smelled of coal smoke and fish, of industry and empire, of a nation that had bent under bombing but refused to break. The women breathed it in despite themselves. They'd been told Britain was starving, crumbling, desperate. But the warehouses stood solid, the cranes still worked, and the soldiers looked well fed if tired. One of the older women, Frau Richter, who'd served as a radio operator in Berlin before the chaos, muttered under her breath, "This isn't what they told us." Her companion shot her a warning glance. Even now, even here, ideology had ears. A British sergeant approached, his boots clicking against wet stone. He held a clipboard and spoke German with a heavy accent but perfect grammar. "You will be processed and transported to a holding facility. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Personal belongings will be inspected but not confiscated unless they pose a security risk. Medical attention will be provided as needed." The words were bureaucratic, official, cold. But then he did something unexpected. He offered a slight nod, not quite a bow, but an acknowledgement. One of the women, Lotte, an interpreter who'd translated propaganda broadcasts from Hamburg, felt something crack inside her chest. Recognition. As if he saw her not as a symbol, not as an enemy, but as a person who was cold and wet and afraid. A soldier stepped forward with a pack of cigarettes. He held it out to Greta, who stared at it as if it might explode. "Go on," he said in fractured German. "Long journey." She took one with shaking fingers. He lit it for her. The small flame illuminated both their faces for a moment. His young and freckled, hers lined with exhaustion and confusion. She inhaled, and the smoke burned her throat, and she realized with sudden, disorienting clarity that she'd expected monsters and found tired boys instead. They were loaded into trucks with canvas covers, benches along the sides, and small windows that let in slats of grey daylight. As the convoy rumbled through Liverpool's bombed streets, the women pressed their faces to the glass. Buildings stood gutted, their insides exposed like broken teeth. Women in headscarves swept debris, children played in rubble. Yet there was order, queues for rations, police directing traffic. a sense of grim functionality. One of the German women began to cry silently, tears streaking the grime on her cheeks. Perhaps she was thinking of Hamburg or Berlin, of cities that no longer existed in any recognizable form. Perhaps she was realizing that suffering wasn't exclusive to any one flag. The trucks turned onto country roads, leaving the destruction behind. Green fields emerged, impossibly green after all the grey, dotted with sheep and ancient stone walls. England in springtime was almost offensively beautiful. Lotta watched it pass and thought of something her grandmother had once said: "The world doesn't pause for war." But this felt different. This felt like the world going on in spite of everything, with an obstinate gentleness that made her Nazi education seem suddenly hollow. When they finally stopped, the gates of the camp rose before them. Barbed wire, yes. Guard towers, yes. But also flower boxes on the administration building, and a sign in German that read, "Prisoners of War Reception Center." Not enemy detention or combatant holding. Reception, as if they were guests checking into a hotel. The first British word one woman learned that day, from a guard who handed her a wool blanket, was welcome. She repeated it to herself that night in her bunk, testing its weight, trying to understand how the language of victors could hold such a shape. The camp sat in rolling countryside somewhere in Yorkshire, a place the women couldn't locate on any mental map. It had been a military training facility before the war, then a holding centre for Italian POWs, and now it housed them. German women who'd worn the uniform of the Reich and now wore confusion like a second skin. The huts were wooden, drafty but clean. The yard was gravel and grass, bounded by wire that seemed almost decorative compared to the electric fences and machine gun nests they'd imagined. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned by soldiers who mostly looked bored. The first morning, they were assembled for inspection and orientation. The camp commandant, a middle-aged major with a moustache and the bearing of a schoolmaster, addressed them through an interpreter. His tone was firm but not harsh. "You are prisoners of war under British custody. You will be treated fairly and in accordance with international law. You will work, you will maintain discipline, and you will be repatriated when circumstances allow. Violence will not be tolerated. Escape attempts will be punished. But cooperation will be met with reasonable accommodation." Reasonable accommodation. The phrase hung in the air like something from another planet. They braced themselves for degradation. Instead, they received medical examinations conducted by a female British doctor, who checked them for lice and disease with clinical efficiency, but also asked, in halting German, if anyone needed treatment for chronic conditions. One woman, terrified of revealing her asthma, admitted it only when the doctor noticed her laboured breathing. Instead of punishment or denial of care, she received an inhaler and instructions. Use this twice daily. Report any worsening. The woman stared at the small device as if it were a religious artifact. Meals were served in a communal hall at fixed times. The first dinner was boiled potatoes, canned meat and bread. Not abundant, not gourmet, but warm and sufficient. Britain was rationing too. Everyone knew that. But the guards ate the same food from the same kitchen. This detail didn't escape notice, Frau Richter whispered. In the camps at home, the guards ate separately. Better. Lotta shot her a warning look, but the thought had already taken root. Why would captors share scarcity with their prisoners? A German nurse named Anneliese marvelled aloud that the food was warm, actually warm, served on metal trays that retained heat. She'd spent 3 years in field hospitals where supplies dwindled, and doctors made impossible choices about who received care and who received morphine for the last time. Here, in captivity, the tea was hot. The absurdity of it made her laugh, a sound that startled everyone, including herself. The laughter died quickly, replaced by embarrassment and confusion. But the damage was done. The first crack in the wall. Another woman cried when a guard noticed she'd cut her hand on a loose nail while moving her bunk and brought her to the medical hut. The nurse, British, brisk, efficient, cleaned the wound, applied iodine, and wrapped it in clean white gauze without a single word of condemnation. The German woman watched the bandaging as if witnessing a miracle. "Danke," she whispered. The British nurse replied in English, something the interpreter later translated, "Just doing my job." But there was no coldness in her eyes, just the tired professionalism of someone who'd seen too much suffering to add to it needlessly. The narrator's voice might interject here, observing from a distance. They were prepared to hate monsters, not people. They'd been trained to see the British as barbaric imperialists, drunk on power and cruelty. But breakfast arrived on time. The guards said, "Good morning" in German, and slowly, terrifyingly, the architecture of their certainty began to crack. Days settled into routine. They woke at 7, had breakfast at 8, worked in rotation, laundry, kitchen duty, mending uniforms, tending the small vegetable gardens that supplied the camp. The work wasn't hard, but it was required. British discipline, they learned, wasn't about brutality, but about structure. Rules existed and were enforced, but fairly. When one woman refused to work out of principle, she was simply denied privileges. No extra tea ration, no access to the library. Not beaten, not starved, just consequences proportional to actions. At night, they gathered in their huts and whispered theories. Some insisted it was a trick, that kindness was the new propaganda designed to break their spirits. Others suggested the British were simply too weak, too civilized, too decadent to properly punish their enemies. But a few like Lotte said nothing. They lay in their bunks and stared at the wooden ceiling and wondered if maybe, just maybe, they'd been lied to about more than military victories. The Reich had told them surrender meant death or slavery. Instead, they'd found barbed wire and politeness. Which reality was the lie? That night, sleep came fitfully. Some women dreamed of home, of cities they'd left behind that might no longer exist. Others dreamed of the faces of British soldiers, young faces, tired faces, faces that didn't match the propaganda posters of sneering imperial villains. And in the darkness of the hut, one woman whispered a question that no one dared answer. How can kindness be a weapon? Weeks bled into each other with the mundane rhythm of captivity. The initial shock of survival gave way to something more insidious. Boredom, routine, and the slow erosion of certainty. The women fell into patterns. Morning roll call, breakfast, work assignments, lunch, afternoon duties, evening recreation, lights out. The sameness of it was almost comforting. A structure that demanded nothing of their spirits, only their bodies. But beneath the routine, a quieter war waged. Internal, psychological, impossible to escape. Some women refused to eat British food at first, convinced it was poisoned, or at least inferior by design. They'd pick at their meals, eating only the bread or the potatoes, avoiding the meat as if it carried contamination. But hunger is a poor ideologue. Within days, even the most stubborn found themselves cleaning their plates. One woman, a true believer who'd volunteered for the Bund Deutscher Mädel at 14, spent 3 days barely eating before finally accepting a full meal. When she finished, she wept into her empty plate, not from gratitude, but from shame at her own weakness. Others began to thaw more quickly. They learned the names of guards, picked up English phrases, even joked in the broken language of occupation. "Good morning, Mr. Tommy," became a greeting that carried layers of meaning, mockery, friendliness, a bridge across the chasm. The guards mostly tolerated it. They were country boys and factory workers in uniform, not ideologues. To them, these German women were a duty to be discharged, not a cause to champion or condemn. Lotte, the former interpreter and propaganda translator, found herself caught between worlds. She'd spent 3 years spinning lies into German, translating Churchill's speeches to make him sound barbaric, crafting radio broadcasts that portrayed Britain as a dying empire. She'd believed it, or convinced herself she'd believed it, because belief was easier than doubt. Now she stood in the camp yard during recreation hour and heard British radio drifting from the administration building. Not propaganda, Beethoven, the Ninth Symphony. Music that belonged to Germany playing from British speakers, treated not as enemy culture but as human heritage. She approached the fence not to escape but to hear better. A British sergeant noticed and walked over. He was older than most guards, maybe 40, with lines around his eyes that suggested laugh or worry in equal measure. He didn't order her away. Instead, he stood beside her, a few feet back, and listened too. When the movement ended, he said in fluent German, "Beautiful, isn't it?" She turned to him, startled. "You speak German?" He nodded. "Studied in Berlin." Before all this, he gestured vaguely at the wire, the war, the world. Shame what happened. He walked away before she could respond. That night, Lotte lay awake and thought about that phrase, shame what happened, not shame what you did, or shame what Germany did. Just what happened, as if the war were a natural disaster, an act of God, something that occurred to people rather than because of them. The moral distance in that phrasing unsettled her more than accusation would have. It suggested that he saw her, and perhaps himself, as caught in machinery beyond their control. But wasn't that exactly the lie? The comfortable lie that absolved everyone? The narrator might observe here. War ends on paper long before it ends in the mind. Treaties are signed, borders redrawn, prisoners catalogued and processed. But the architecture of belief, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who they are, that takes longer to dismantle. It crumbles brick by brick, usually when you're not looking, in moments too small to matter until suddenly they're all that matters. The women developed their own hierarchies. Those who'd held rank in military service tried to maintain it, but it rang hollow without an institution to back them. The nurses formed one group, bonded by shared trauma. The auxiliaries, clerks and radio operators and logistics workers, formed another. And then there were the outsiders, women who'd been conscripted late in the war and never fully absorbed the ideology. They adapted fastest, their lack of conviction making them flexible. Arguments erupted occasionally. One woman insisted they should refuse all work as a form of resistance. Another countered that cooperation was survival. A third suggested that maybe, just maybe, they were lucky to be here instead of starving in a bombed-out city. That last comment nearly caused a fistfight. Lucky, someone hissed. Lucky to be prisoners. But later, in the quiet of night, even the angry ones admitted to themselves that yes, perhaps, in the cosmic joke of war, captivity in rural England was a kind of luck. The British sergeant, his name was Tom, they learned, though he never encouraged familiarity, began to appear more regularly. He'd make rounds, check work assignments, occasionally stop to exchange words. With Lotta, he was especially careful, perhaps recognizing in her the same internal war he'd witnessed in other prisoners. One afternoon, as she worked in the garden pulling weeds, he paused and said, "The war's ending. You know that, don't you?" She didn't look up. "We hear rumors." He crouched down, eye level, voice low. "Not rumors, facts. Germany's collapsing. Berlin's surrounded. Best to start thinking about what comes after." She wanted to argue, to insist that the Reich would rally, that superweapons would turn the tide, that the Führer had a plan, but the words died in her throat. She'd translated enough intelligence reports, heard enough truth beneath the lies. She knew, they all knew. The question wasn't whether Germany would lose, but what losing meant. "What comes after?" she echoed. Tom straightened. "That's up to you." He walked away, leaving her with hands in the dirt and thoughts in chaos. Spring arrived with aggressive cheerfulness. Lambs in the fields, flowers erupting along the fence line, birds that didn't care about national boundaries. The camp commandant announced a new program. The women would work on nearby farms, supervised but allowed outside the wire, earning small wages that would be held in trust for their repatriation. The announcement caused panic. Some feared it was a trap. Others worried about civilians, about hatred, about being vulnerable in a country they'd bombed from the air. But labour was scarce. British men were dead, wounded, or still fighting in Europe. The farms needed hands, and prisoners were hands. Economics trumped ideology, as it often does. The first work party left on a Monday morning. 12 women in a truck, 2 guards, heading to a dairy farm 5 miles away. Lotta was among them. She sat in the back of the truck and watched the countryside roll past and felt like a ghost haunting her own life. The farmer who met them was old, maybe 70, with gnarled hands and a face like weathered leather. He looked them over without particular emotion. "You know anything about milking?" he asked in English. The guard translated. A few women nodded. "Right then," the farmer said. "Show me." What followed was the strangest kind of normalcy. German women and British guards and an old farmer working side by side in a barn that smelled of hay and manure and animal warmth. The cows didn't care about the war. They needed milking. The work was familiar, almost meditative. Hands found rhythm, and for a few hours, ideology took a back seat to necessity. At lunch, the farmer's wife, a small woman with white hair and stern eyes, brought out bread and cheese and thermoses of tea. She set them on a wooden table in the yard and stepped back, arms crossed, watching. The women hesitated. The guards nodded. Eat. They ate. The bread was coarse but filling, the cheese sharp, the tea bitter and sweet at once. The farmer's wife watched them chew and swallow, and gradually her posture softened. "More if you want it," she said through the guard's translation. One woman, overcome, said "Danke" with such force it sounded like a prayer. The farmer's wife nodded once, briskly, and returned to the house. On the third day of farm work, a small boy appeared. He couldn't have been more than 8, with his mother's eyes and his father's absent smile. Killed in North Africa, Lotta learned later. The boy held something behind his back and approached the women with the fearless curiosity of children. The guards tensed, but the farmer waved them off. The boy stepped up to Greta, the nurse, and held out a red apple. For you, he said in English. Greta stared at it. The boy pushed it closer. Go on. It's from our tree. She took it with shaking hands. The apple was bright, perfect, absurd in its simple generosity. She looked at the boy, at the apple, at the guard who was trying not to smile. And then she did something she hadn't done since before the war. She burst into tears. Not quiet, dignified tears, but ugly, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. The boy, startled, ran back to his mother. The women gathered around Greta, unsure, awkward. And Greta held that apple like it was the last good thing in the world. The guards noticed everything. Some treated the women like workers, maintaining professional distance. Others, especially the younger ones, grew more relaxed, sharing cigarettes, teaching English phrases, even laughing at clumsy jokes. Tom, the sergeant, watched it all with the careful assessment of someone who understood that every interaction was a tiny negotiation with humanity. He never fraternized, but he never brutalized either. He simply maintained the space where both sides could remember they were people. Rumors swirled back at camp. One of them smiled at a guard. Did you see how Greta looked at the farmer's boy? They're making us soft. They're making us human. The arguments were whispered, fierce, confused. Some women clung harder to ideology, as if recognizing that losing it meant losing themselves. Others felt ideology slipping away like water through fingers, and rather than panic, they felt relieved. The weight of certainty, it turned out, was exhausting. The narrator might step in. The barbed wire was for formality. The real walls were in their heads. The Reich had built them carefully, brick by brick, lesson by lesson, parade by parade. Now those walls were developing cracks, and sunlight was getting through. Some welcomed it, others feared it, because if the enemy wasn't evil, if the enemy was just tired farmers and polite guards and little boys with apples, then what had it all been for? One afternoon, working alongside a British officer repairing a broken tractor, Lotta found herself laughing, actually laughing. He'd made a joke about the stubbornness of English machinery, and she'd translated it poorly, and the mistranslation was funnier than the original. And suddenly, they were both laughing in the sunlight. Covered in grease, the war momentarily forgotten. The sound shocked her, her own genuine laughter untainted by duty or performance. It was the first time she'd laughed like that since 1942, maybe earlier. She stopped abruptly, embarrassed. He noticed but said nothing, just handed her a wrench. The moment passed, but she carried it with her back to camp, turned it over in her mind like a strange coin from a foreign country. Humanity, once forbidden, had begun to feel natural again. Winter came early that year, or perhaps it just felt that way because hope was dying. The Red Cross established a mail system for prisoners of war, a small mercy in the machinery of conflict. Letters could be sent and received, censored but intact, tiny threads connecting prisoners to the world they'd left behind. The women waited for mail call with the desperation of the drowning waiting for air. Names were called. Some women received letters, thin envelopes that meant contact, proof of life, continuity. Others waited and heard nothing. Lotta received a letter in November. She recognized her brother's handwriting on the envelope and felt her heart lift and then immediately plummet, because the letter was dated June 1943, over 2 years old. She opened it carefully, as if it might crumble. He wrote about his unit, stationed outside Stalingrad, about the cold, about missing home. He tried to be cheerful. When this is over, we'll go to the mountains like we used to. Remember? You and me and Papa. We'll drink beer and pretend none of this happened. The letter ended with a promise to write again soon. Lotta sat on her bunk and read it 3 times. Then she asked the guard if there were more letters. He checked. There weren't. Later, through unofficial channels, she learned the truth. Her brother had died at Stalingrad in February 1943. The letter she held was written weeks before his death, a ghost's voice speaking across time. That night, she took the letter to the camp's small stove, used for heating water. She watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. The guard on duty, a young corporal named Davies, saw but said nothing. After she returned to her bunk, he quietly left a tin cup of extra tea on the table near her. No words exchanged, just the tea, hot and sweet, a gesture too small to matter except that it mattered entirely. The camp's warmth, physical and emotional, contrasted cruelly with the void of home. More letters arrived or didn't arrive. Hamburg destroyed, Berlin in ruins, Dresden gone, families displaced, missing, dead. The architecture of grief has no blueprint. Each woman carried her losses differently. Some became stone, refusing to feel. Others wept openly, past caring about dignity. And a few, like Lotta, simply went quiet, disappearing into themselves until they resembled ghosts. Frau Richter received a letter from a cousin stating that her husband and 2 sons were missing, presumed dead. She read it twice, folded it carefully, placed it in her pocket, and went to work in the kitchen as if nothing had happened. For 3 days she functioned normally. On the 4th day she collapsed while peeling potatoes, a sound like a building falling, and had to be carried to the medical hut. She woke hours later, disoriented, and the first thing she said was, "My boys." The British nurse held her hand. "I know," she said through the interpreter. "I lost mine too." The narrator might reflect, "It's a strange thing, to find compassion in the uniform you were raised to fear, to discover that your enemy has also buried children, also wept into pillows, also wonders what the point of survival is when everything you loved is ash." Grief, it turns out, is not a nationalist sentiment. It acknowledges no borders, respects no flags. It simply is. Tom the sergeant had a new habit. After particularly difficult mail calls, he'd quietly make extra rations available, a bit of chocolate, an extra slice of bread, sometimes just cigarettes. He never made a show of it. The supplies simply appeared. Some women took them gratefully, others refused, pride demanding some form of resistance even now. But most accepted because hunger and grief are poor companions, and comfort, even from an enemy, is still comfort. One woman, Annalisa the nurse, began working with the camp's medical staff. She'd lost her entire family, parents, siblings, fiancé, and found that staying busy helped her forget for hours at a time. The British medical officer, an older woman named Dr. Shaw, treated Annalise like a colleague rather than a prisoner. They worked together on small ailments, infections, the occasional injury. Dr. Shaw taught Annalisa English medical terminology. Annalisa taught Dr. Shaw a few German phrases. In the sterile space of the medical hut, they found a common language beyond words, the language of caring for the broken. December brought news that the local village was organizing a Christmas collection for war orphans. The camp commandant, in a gesture either brilliant or insane, asked if the German women wanted to contribute. The request caused an uproar. Contribute? To British orphans? With what? Some women were insulted. Others were curious. Lotta, emerging from her grief just enough to function, said quietly, "We could knit. We have yarn from the Red Cross packages." The idea caught. Not everyone participated, but enough did. A small group of women spent evenings knitting scarves, hats, tiny mittens for children they'd never meet. Children whose fathers might have killed their brothers, whose mothers might have celebrated German deaths. Tom saw them working one evening and paused. "That's good of you," he said. Lotta looked up. "It's not goodness. It's just..." She struggled for the word in German, then in English. "Something to do." He smiled slightly. "Sometimes that's enough." She thought about that later, lying in her bunk. Sometimes survival wasn't about grand gestures or moral awakenings. Sometimes it was just knitting for orphans because your hands needed purpose and your heart needed anything other than its own pain. Spring 1945 arrived with crocuses and rumours. Germany was collapsing, everyone knew it, even those who refused to admit knowing. The camp buzzed with nervous energy. Guards whispered. Women whispered. The BBC broadcasts, no longer forbidden since denial had become pointless, reported Allied advances, the fall of cities, the closing ring around Berlin. And then, on a rain-soaked afternoon in early May, the announcement. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. The camp fell silent. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of people confronting an event so massive they couldn't yet pass its meaning. The commandant assembled everyone, guards and prisoners together, and spoke briefly. "The war in Europe has ended. You will remain here until repatriation arrangements can be made. This will take time. I ask for your patience and continued cooperation." He paused, looked at the women, and added something off script. "You have conducted yourselves with dignity. That matters." The women returned to their huts in silence. Some cried. Some sat motionless. Greta, the nurse who'd wept over an apple, whispered, "Then what was it all for?" No one answered, because there was no answer that didn't sound like blasphemy or madness. Everything they'd sacrificed, everyone they'd lost, all the propaganda they'd believed or pretended to believe, it had led to this. Unconditional surrender, total defeat. The Reich was gone. The Führer was dead. And they were alive in a British prison camp, knitting scarves for orphans. The next morning the women expected something. Celebration. Condemnation. Instead, routine continued. Breakfast at 8, Work assignments, lunch, afternoon duties. The British Guards went about their business with the same tired professionalism. If they felt triumph, they didn't show it. Perhaps they were too exhausted. Perhaps victory, when it finally comes, looks less like glory and more like relief that the dying can stop. Then something extraordinary happened. In the afternoon, the British lowered their Union Jack to half-mast. The women watched from the yard, confused. Why half-mast? Who were they mourning? Tom, seeing their confusion, explained. For all the dead, ours and yours. Everyone. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything they'd been taught about victors and vanquished, that several women began to cry. One called out, "But we lost!" Tom looked at her steadily. So did we. Different ledgers, same loss. And then, in what would later seem like a fever dream, the commandant did something unprecedented. He allowed the women to hang a small white cloth on a secondary flagpole. Not a German flag, not even a white flag of surrender in the traditional sense, but simply a white sheet repurposed as a symbol, a truce flag. One woman asked why. The commandant, a man who'd fought in the First War and buried too many in this one, said simply, "Because we're all tired of flags that demand blood." The days that followed were strange. The women were still prisoners, still bound by wire and rules, but something had shifted. Guards spoke more freely. Women asked questions about England, about what came next, about whether they'd be prosecuted. The answers were mostly honest. I don't know. Depends. Best to hope for mercy. But the honesty itself was a gift. No one was pretending anymore. Lotta found herself in conversation with Tom more frequently. He'd stop by wherever she was working, garden, kitchen, laundry, and they'd talk. About the war carefully, about books more easily, about what peace might look like tentatively. Once she asked him, "Do you hate us?" He thought for a long moment. "I hate what happened, what was done, but you..." He gestured at the women working around them. "You're just people who made bad bets on bad men, like a lot of us." She wanted to argue, to insist it was more complicated, that they'd been deceived, coerced, trapped. But was that true? Or was that just the comfortable lie? She translated propaganda. She'd known on some level that it was lies. She'd done it anyway. Survival, she'd told herself. Fear, she'd told herself. But also, if she was honest, belief, or at least the willing suspension of disbelief. What happens to people like us? She asked. Tom sighed. You live, or you don't. Either way, you'll have to decide what kind of person you want to be, now that no one's telling you who to be. One evening, the women organized a small gathering, not a celebration but an acknowledgement. They sang German folk songs, not military marches, but the old songs their grandmothers had sung. The guards listened. Some even hummed along to melodies that transcended language. When they finished, Dr. Shaw, the British medical officer, stood and recited a poem in German, Heine, before the Nazis banned him, about exile, about longing, about the impossibility of going home. Her accent was terrible, but her meaning was clear. When she finished, Annalisa stood and, in broken English, said, "Thank you for seeing us." Dr. Shaw nodded. "That's all we can do, isn't it? See each other." News came that repatriation would begin in July. The women would be returned to Germany, to the Allied zones, to wherever remained of home. Tom told Lotta privately, and she felt panic rise. "I don't want to go back. There's nothing there." He looked at her with something like sympathy. "You have to. Can't stay here," she asked, half joking. "Could I? Stay in England? Start over?" He smiled sadly. "No prisoner stays by choice. That's not how it works." She understood. Freedom wasn't the opposite of captivity. Freedom was having to choose what to do with your life when no one was choosing for you. The narrator might offer the emotional thesis here. In the end, they weren't prisoners of Britain. They were prisoners of what they believed. The wire had always been optional, a physical formality for a war already lost. The real prison was the architecture of their own certainty, and that was crumbling brick by brick. Some feared what lay beyond those walls. Others felt relieved. But all of them, in their own way, understood that going home meant returning as different people to a different country. The Germany they'd left didn't exist anymore. Perhaps it never had. July arrived with heat and finality. The repatriation lists were posted, names in alphabetical order, destinations assigned by Allied bureaucracy. The women packed their few belongings, donated clothing, Red Cross packages, letters they'd kept, a few trinkets they'd made or received. The camp, which had been their world for over a year, suddenly felt temporary again. Barracks that had become familiar now looked shabby. The yard where they'd worked and talked and argued and cried. Just dirt and grass. The village sent representatives on the last week. A small delegation of farmers, shopkeepers, and the boy's mother, the boy who'd given Greta the apple. They brought gifts, flowers, bread, small jars of jam. Nothing grand, but tangible reminders that not all memory would be bitter. The farmer's wife, the stern woman who'd fed them lunch, shook hands with each woman. When she got to Greta, she paused, pulled her into an embrace. "Bless you, dear," she said. Greta, who'd survived field hospitals and bombings and captivity, who'd thought herself beyond tears, wept into this British woman's shoulder. The guards organised a small farewell. Not a ceremony, but an acknowledgement. They stood in formation as the women boarded the trucks, and, this mattered more than protocol should have allowed, they saluted. Not the casual salute of duty, but the full, formal salute given to departing soldiers. Some women returned the gesture. Others simply nodded, unable to speak. Lotta found Tom before boarding. She'd written something in English, painstakingly, and she handed him the paper. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for what I was part of, but I know you gave me a chance to be something other than that. Thank you." He read it, folded it carefully, put it in his pocket. "Write to me if you can. Let me know you're all right," she promised, though they both knew she probably wouldn't. Some connections were too tangled in history to survive peace. The trucks rolled out through gates that had defined their world. The women looked back at the camp, at the wire now meaningless, at the guards waving, at the village visible in the distance. Lotta stared until it all disappeared into landscape, into memory, into the category of things that happened but couldn't be adequately explained. She'd come here an enemy. She left as a witness. The journey to the processing centre took hours. They rode through England one last time. Cities rebuilding, people working, life insisting on itself despite everything. At the port, they saw other refugees, displaced persons from a dozen nations, all trying to find their way back to countries that had changed in their absence. The chaos was bureaucratic, orderly, but underneath it all ran a current of desperation. Where do you go when home is a concept more than a place? The ship that would take them back across the channel was waiting. Lotta stood on deck as it pulled, away from British soil, watching the shoreline recede. She thought about everything. The arrival in rain, the politeness that had baffled them, Tom's quiet compassion, the apple, the knitting, the songs, the flag at half-mast. She thought about her brother's letter, now ash. She thought about what came next. The Allied zones, the denazification trials, the reconstruction, the collective amnesia and memory that would define post-war Germany. She pulled out her journal, one of the few possessions she'd accumulated, and wrote by the failing light. "I came here an enemy. I leave as a witness. I witnessed mercy where I expected vengeance. I witnessed humanity in the face I'd been taught was inhuman. I witnessed the collapse of certainty and the terrible freedom of doubt. I don't know what I believe anymore, except this, that the war was lost long before it ended, and perhaps that was the only mercy. To be defeated by people who remembered we were people. History will forget this, I think. History remembers victories and atrocities, not small acts of decency. But I will remember. I have to, because if I forget, then what was any of it for?" The narrator closes with reflection. History forgets. The quiet mercies, the kindness that never made it to textbooks, the soldier who offered a cigarette, the nurse who bandaged without judgment, the sergeant who spoke of what comes after, as if there could be an after. These moments don't fit neatly into narratives of good and evil, victor and vanquished. They're too complicated, too human. But they happened. In a prison camp in Yorkshire, in the space between war and peace. They happened. German women learned that their enemies were tired farmers and polite guards. British soldiers learned that their prisoners were frightened women far from home. And for a brief moment, in the wreckage of everything, humanity flickered like a candle refusing to go out. The final image, the ship disappearing into the fog of the channel, leaving behind only the memory of footprints in British soil, and empty teacups on a wooden table, still faintly warm.